Welcome back to the Clean Techies podcast, where we interview climate tech founders and VCs to discuss all things building and investing to solve the biggest challenge of our generation, climate change. Today, Somil and I interviewed Jeff Chapin to discuss what he's doing at Haven Energy, a home electrification service with a particular focus on batteries. It was a really fascinating conversation, including topics like how they only pitched to investors to raise their seed, and how building a climate business is not about playing to people's goodwill to solve climate change, but rather to build a better technology that serves customers better. Really great conversation with Jeff, and we hope you enjoy this episode. All right, welcome to the show, Jeff. How's it going?
It's great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Really glad to have you. Somil and I are excited to have this conversation. So I guess let's just kick things right off. Give us a quick background on yourself, just kind of who are you and what are you working on today?
Yeah, for sure. My name is Jeff Chapin. I'm a product designer by trade, but kind of old school product designer. I studied mechanical engineering and physical product design. I worked for about a decade at IDEO, the big design consulting firm. So I touched on a ton of different industries there, some of which were relevant for what I'm doing today. I left in, say, 2009 and started working in the developing world in taking product design and market development to issues around clean water access to improve sanitation in rural areas of Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar, Kenya, Ghana. Did that for a couple of years, then somehow through a friend that I met in that world, ended up co-founding Casper in 2013, the direct-to-consumer mattress and sleep company, and ran product and in the early days supply chain for that business, and then left in 2021. As we talked about before the show started, we were living in the Bay Area. I have a wife and 3 little kids, and when COVID happened, we were just locked up in our house with twin 2-month-olds. We decided to make a change, and we moved to a small town in rural Wyoming for my wife's work, and that actually is what brought me back to some of the work I'd done at IDEO earlier in my career, because we had purchased a 110-year-old house that was uninsulated, had literally a 90-year-old natural gas boiler, original windows in the house. And I post Casper, I took about 8 months off and just dug into home construction and learning about the space. I renovated the house dramatically and started on my own journey of home electrification. And that's where I ran into some of the difficulties, which led me to start this business I've been working on the past year, which is Haven Energy. And we're focused at present on deploying and accelerating the adoption of residential batteries. And we can talk more about it, I think, later in the show. But essentially, it's a nascent market and a fairly new product for homeowners to think about, but has a lot of benefits, both in terms of costs and resiliency and environmental benefits that we can get into.
Yeah, sounds good. So I think it's quite interesting. So you wanted to electrify your home just because you were going through the process of renovating your house. Have you always had like a particular interest in climate? Like why specifically go and build a company around it, right? Just because it's in your blood, entrepreneurism can't be can't be taken down.
I've always had an interest, I would say, in basic human needs. So in my time at IDEO, I tended to focus on medical devices, healthcare products, essentially like what are the basic human needs that in the US, most people are still having to deal with. In my time there, I did some work with General Electric on a battery, actually. They had a molten sodium battery, which was branded the GE Durathon battery.
Hey there. Quick break to remind any founders or VCs listening, if you are looking for deal flow, seeking to raise funding, looking for partners to help service your needs, or perhaps you're looking for corporate investment partners, feel free to reach out to us through our Slack channel, which can be found in the description. Because we meet a lot of people in this space, we set aside time each week to make introductions to the various people that we encounter. This is something we do free of charge in order to help these incredible companies solving climate change to scale. Looking forward to hearing from you in the Slack channel.
And it was originally built for locomotives, for hybrid locomotives, and then they were looking at adapting it for peak demand shaving, which is a way for commercial electric customers to reduce their bills, and also they were looking at critical infrastructure backup. So very different chemistry than the batteries that are being used today. But it was my first real look at both the economic and technical side of batteries and battery management. And I found it super interesting. Just the energy markets are fairly opaque, and most people actually aren't that interested in them. But when you get into it, they're quite fascinating. And I also worked on the consumer side of my time at IDEO. We had worked on home energy monitors, which don't really exist in the marketplace right now, but at the time, there were companies putting out, I would say, like pre-Nest devices, which with touch screens that allowed you to monitor electricity consumption, gas consumption, water consumption, and we were looking at how to use gamification and social networks to drive behavior change to reduce consumption. And so I kind of always had an interest. Then I obviously went and worked in developing world in water and sanitation. Casper, if you think about like the mattress industry, is not particularly interesting, honestly. But sleep as like one of these basic human needs that we in developed economies still have a lot of issues with, and generally a bad relationship, was super interesting. And so I think the broader promise of that business was actually, in line with my history of looking at basic human needs. And obviously now we're faced with both a climate crisis and also like an energy resilience crisis, where we're getting more and more, climate-induced weather events, more outages, more blackouts in areas where batteries can help and home electrification can help.
Super insightful. I think one of the things that you pointed out, it's related to things that we see in terms of other companies and other founder stories. I wonder if you feel as though the industry was, whether it was easy to learn or there was some, real challenges coming from sort of an outside operational background, because in a lot of the companies that I see, for example, working in venture capital, you have the model of the industry insider who will come and be able to tell you how things work. And then you have the role of the operational executive, maybe, more similar to your background, which is, excellence in one operating role can translate over to another. Which side do you think you fell more on? And, how do you think that helped you succeed?
It's a really interesting question, because I think when we started Casper, I had actually, like, our CEO and business partner, Philip Krim, he had dabbled in e-commerce selling of mattresses previously, so he understood that side of it. And this was like early e-commerce, and I had worked at IDEO with some of the larger, mattress brands that an average American would know. So we kind of knew the industry. We made the mistake, though, of not hiring any industry insiders for years. And so I think it was year 6 or year 7 before, on the operations side, we brought somebody who used to run mattress manufacturing plants, and the insight, like, he could answer in a second questions that we had spent years trying to figure out. And so I think you need a balance of, like, you obviously need the outsider view, so you try something different. But in any industry, and particularly energy, which is very complex, there's a lot of value of having insiders. And so as we've built Haven, we're a small team. I think we have, in addition to the founding team, I think we have 12 or 13 employees. Half of them come from either Tesla, used to work on Powerwall. They worked in solar sales or solar install operations. They worked at SPAN, the smart electrical company. So we're balancing, like, outside expertise with inside knowledge. And I think that is an important thing to do. To your earlier question, the first part of the question, there's a lot to learn. We spent 6 months before we even started to put pen to paper on, like, what this idea would be, just doing phone calls. And it's one of the things that, like, I'm very grateful for. We started with, like, a friend who, so one of our co-founders, Phillips from Texas, and he was childhood friends with somebody who worked in the energy industry. Not the right part. He was building natural gas peaker plants, but he understood the energy markets. And so we started with a phone call to him, and then we, as the conversation's going, you have half hour of their time. They might mention another person or another business, and just graciously at the end, you ask, like, hey, can we get an intro? And I think everybody offered and everybody followed through. And I think it's like, I think human nature is still generally good, and people like to help each other out. And I don't think it's just self-interest. I think they just like to share their knowledge and help each other out. And so we had dozens and dozens of these phone calls to learn the industry and shape. And we would go back to people like, hey, we talked 2 months ago, like our ideas have evolved. Can we catch up on a phone? And we also have to follow through. Like when we started the business and raised our seed round of funding, we sent notes out to those people like, thanks for the support. This is where we are. You'll see updates from us going forward. So I do think you have to close the loop with the people that have helped you, and keep them kind of involved, because they have essentially given you something, and it's good to return the favor, even if it's just information or an update.
Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. Yeah, I think this is a pretty interesting point. This is something that has been some of the usually like the biggest like eye-opening things that founders have talked about before is like, hey, we really like we tried to build something and then we went back and realized, hey, we just need to do a ton of like customer discovery and talking to people and understanding what's going on. Especially if you're an outsider, right? If you're somebody who's not familiar with the space, you can actually learn the insights pretty quickly if you're willing to just put in the effort to have those conversations, talk to experts, and just go down the rabbit hole. Because I'd say people in climate, I feel like they're a little bit more generous with their, recommendations and sharing, because they have, the broader goal of like, let's solve climate change in mind usually, and they're not going to be too stingy, with their Rolodex. One thing I do want to ask is, for people who are listening who want to build a climate tech company, but are not quite on the journey yet, how should they get going? Any mindset things that they should develop to get going? Like what's your tips for them to really just get the train moving?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, you just have to have curiosity and like follow lines of inquiry. So, you're going to have maybe an idea about something you could do. Just start learning and have those conversations with people that can give you feedback that might know more than you. It's a little hard to like give this feedback. You can't listen to every piece of feedback and take it like follow what they're recommending. You have to put your own filter on it. But I think it's just, you got to get out there. I think it's like extra hard in this era where people are working from home and used to like being a bit more insular. It's stupid small things. Like we went to the industry trade show for solar and just walked and talked to people, and they thought we were idiots. Like we told them what our business idea was in the early days, and like, well, I think like 9 out of 10 people said it was a terrible idea. So if it was like 10 out of 10, we might have turned back. This one person was interested. It was the same for Casper, honestly. Like if you're getting too many people who think it's a good idea, it's probably like too obvious or something. So I don't know. I think the simple advice is just get out there and start learning. You have to always, it might be something that's hard to learn if you don't have it innately, but you just have to have curiosity. So like, if you're having a conversation with an expert in the industry, so like for us, we talk to somebody, like who runs ERCOT, or it works on a trading desk, or runs a retail electric provider or something. You generally, it's a bad idea if you run out of things to ask them or her before your 30 minutes is up. Like you got to have curiosity and do your homework ahead of time, so that you have a ton of questions. If they're giving short answers, you gotta engage them.
Yeah, kind of like prepping for a podcast. No, just kidding. No, I think I think this is interesting. I really like that. It's helpful advice. I think it can be difficult, but yeah, just get out there and have the curiosity. That is a hard one to develop, I think, if you don't have it naturally, but it can be done. So let's talk a little bit more then, particularly about Haven, right? So I want to understand, you've mentioned where the impetus came from, while you were remodeling your house, you wanted to electrify it and you maybe had some issues. Maybe if you want to elaborate a little bit on what particularly you saw as a problem and why why you're like, hey, like this is worth starting a company for. But generally speaking, want to just kind of get the really like deep overview of what you guys do, and how you got started?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of my own experience and journey, if you look at home electrification or building or like electrifying a average person's life, there's only like 4 or 5 things you can do. You can get an EV, so you get rid of your internal combustion engine. You can switch from a furnace or a boiler to a heat pump. You can switch from a gas stove or electric stove, like a resistance electric stove, to an induction stove. You can switch to a heat pump, hot water heater, and then you can add generation. You can add solar, and you can add a battery, which kind of touches everything. But there's not, it's a very short list. And coupled with that, which I mentioned earlier, you do have to look at like efficiency, because if you're gonna, in this house, through air sealing and insulation, I could cut my energy consumption even before I switched to electrification by 40%. And so you got to do that first, because if you don't do that first, you're going to size a heat pump for the wrong heating load. When you look to electrify your home, there's only like a small set of things that you can do. So you can switch from an internal combustion engine car to an EV. You can switch from a fossil fuel heat to a heat pump. You can change from a natural gas stove to an induction stove. You can change from a gas or resistance, electrical resistance hot water heater to a heat pump hot water heater. And then you can add generations. You can add solar on your roof. You can add a battery, which pairs naturally with solar, but also has some functions when you think about interacting with the other electrified appliances in your home. You shouldn't do that, honestly, until you look at efficiency. So what is the heat loss from your home? In this, where we moved here, just through insulation and air sealing, we reduced the heat loss or energy consumption of the home for heating by 40%. And so if you don't do that first, you don't fix that first, you're going to specify a heat pump that is oversized, and it'll actually be inefficient to operate it. And so in terms of my experience, we bought an EV, and I found that to be quite easy. I called an electrician for $300. He came and wired a 240 volt plug, and we plugged in the charger, and it worked. And so I was like, all right, that's not that hard. There are businesses that are looking to do that at scale, but it didn't seem like there was like great opportunity there. When it came to adding a heat pump, that was tremendously difficult. I could not find, and granted, I live in a small town, but I could not find anybody who was conversant in heat pumps. And specifically, we have hot water heat and radiators. And so getting like an air to water or water to water heat pump where you're like pulling heat out of the ground, near impossible. And I did my own, there's these like manual J calculations where you're calculating heat loss from your home. And I spent forever researching this and modeling my own house, stuff that I had time on my hands and I had a technical background. And then I started working with a plumber to specify, he wanted to put in a appliance which was rated for twice as much BTU as my calculations were saying, and it was a couple $1,000s more expensive. And what it would do is it would heat up the water really quick.
Yeah, basically. So we've had a little bit of technical difficulties, but basically, if I understand correctly, you were having like a tremendously difficult opportunity, like getting your heat pump installed. And this kind of like essentially led to you realizing that, hey, we need to provide these services in a way that's like simpler and more accessible. Is that right? Hey there. Are you building a climate tech business and looking for very specialized talent? Consider reaching out to our sponsors, NextWave Partners. NextWave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change yourself, feel free to reach out to NextWave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page.
Yeah. Thanks for summing it up. I ran into the same thing. I wanted a battery backup because we get a lot of outages because it's pretty windy here. And that was also equally difficult. I couldn't find somebody who would actually even do it.
Really?
And
Wow.
so it struck us that a lot of the appliances, although they will improve over time, they're already good enough to provide the benefits, and they're affordable enough. And that's happened very recently, like the price of solar, or the efficacy and price of batteries just driven by EVs. Those have come down dramatically in the last decade. And so there is this like opening of a window. But what was not there was the service side. How do I actually figure out what to get? Construction is notoriously difficult, especially renovation, because you have every home is unique and you need to design around that home. And so that's what the business is focused on, is like, how do we accelerate the adoption of batteries through a service model? And so we're creating tools and a platform that enable both us to sell and other people to sell on top of our platform, to get batteries properly specified, installed. And then the last part is maybe non-intuitive, is operated. So once the battery is installed, it can do a lot of things, both for the grid and for the homeowner. And there is a need for active management of the battery, or at least intelligent management of the battery over time. And so that is also a function working in. And that's very different generally than like most of the home electrification installations, where it's kind of set it and forget it. Maybe on solar, you need to monitor to make sure you don't have like an inverter go out or a panel go out. But you're not actively optimizing the solar in a way that you might with a battery.
You brought up a really good way of thinking about it. Do you follow the All In podcast by chance?
I do occasionally, but not really. I used to listen to podcasts religiously, but now it's very hard to find time.
Well, hopefully we can change your mind on this one. But related to the for the All In podcast, their most recent episode actually brought up a really interesting counter viewpoint to the traditional way that we look at climate. And I think that's especially relevant here for your founding story. It's the idea that you can have a focus on bringing renewables, more reliable energy storage, less pollutants, all of these things to improve the way that we access and use energy without necessarily using, the goodwill of supporting climate as the only reason to go forward with a business, to go forward with a business model and bring something to market. I feel like I really heard that in your story, but I wonder throughout your journey being an entrepreneur within climate, within energy, if you've had to balance those conflicting viewpoints between the people who are sort of wanting you to tell your message as saving the planet. And I think that where you naturally more gravitate towards was this is just a good innovation that should be brought to market with the benefit of, bringing, good energy along the way.
I would say it's an interesting question. We've never felt pressure to go one way or the other. Obviously, like we got into this because we had an interest in climate and electrification and the benefits. We've done our due diligence to understand the benefits, the climate benefits that home batteries can have. And so we have confidence and comfort in that. When we look at our audiences, I'd almost say it's the exact opposite. Like, I don't think there's much of a business you can build if you're relying on like climate interest or climate goodwill. And I think on the consumer side, the battery has three benefits. It reduces your electricity costs. It provides you resilience, so backup power, and it does reduce your carbon footprint. And honestly, like when we started selling, we were talking about all three on equal footing, and now we don't even talk about the carbon footprint. We never found a good way to talk about carbon footprint. It seemed inconsequential to homeowners. And so we talk about energy cost savings and resiliency. That's what matters to people. Those are emotional and, as they say in politics, like kitchen table issues. On the investor side, I would say, like, particularly in this investing climate, they're looking for viable businesses, large markets. And I think you need to have a large audience and appeal to multiple motivations. And candidly, also, we're kind of piggybacking on a solar industry that has learned that you need more than one motivation to close a deal and sell a job. And so that's been learned many, many times in the solar industry. And so we're building from there. And obviously in a sales presentation, you might tailor the message based on what you're hearing from the customer. And we have some tools that help us understand like where somebody's coming from emotionally and mentally when we start talking to them. But I think we've got essentially like these 3 tools in the tool shed to talk about. Although we talk more about bill savings and resiliency than climate.
I think this is quite interesting because I come, as I mentioned before the show, I come from a really rural area as well. And people are usually like, oh, climate change is a hoax or whatever they want to say. But if you put the focus on like, hey, this is actually just a better product and it's substantially better, then you don't have to rely on all those things to try to convince people to do something that, is more costly because it's just a better business. It saves them money, it's more convenient, whatever it is. That's how the real climate solutions are going to be adopted. And just very quickly, right? Because if people can have a better thing, they talk to their neighbors, right? And they make it happen. The thing I always find fascinating, and I'd be kind of curious to get your thoughts on this here, is you work probably with a lot of contractors, right? Quote unquote blue collar workers to install these things. And usually those are the people who are like, oh, I'm not interested in this like renewables thing or whatnot. So I'd be kind of curious to hear like how, I don't know exactly how to ask this. Maybe how you approach these contractors about working in this thing that is kind of quote unquote climate focused, and what their reaction is to it, and then just generally speaking, how how you've seen them kind of take on to the space, or if they really enjoy it a lot.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think so. Going back to some of the things we discussed earlier, very early when we were formulating the business, we did a lot of ethnographic research. So we talked to homeowners, we talked to battery manufacturers, we talked to essentially grid operators and the people that operate the energy markets. We also talked to electricians. And I would say that like the actual like core driving thing for an electrician, at least the ones that we've been learning from and working from, is really business focused. Is this a good business opportunity for me? Are you going to be a good business partner? Are you going to deliver, give me jobs that are well specified, pay me on time? Am I going to be efficient with my time? And less so about what they're doing. I would say we did learn there's like different types of electricians and different levels of interest in trying something new, and that could be anything new. Just like most jobs out there, you make more money when you get good at a narrow set of things and do it repeatedly. And so in larger metros, you might have an electrician that just wires swimming pools, or an electrician that just wires EVs, or just does recessed lighting, and there's enough business to support that. And we had a guy we were talking to in Boston, and we had actually sought him out because we saw that he was installing EV chargers. We're like, all right, anybody who's installing EV chargers is probably an early adopter of technology and wants to grow their business. So let's seek those people out and start to talk to them. And he brought up swimming pools, and he said, wiring a swimming pool is really easy. But he said, I'd never wire a swimming pool because I don't do it enough. And if I make a mistake, I'm going to kill somebody. And he said, I'll let the pool guys do the pool electrical. And so I think it's more about like understanding how they run their business, how they think about good opportunities, what's important to them in terms of cash flow and reliability, of essentially us being lead gen to an installer. And we have to structure our business to fit into that. We're very fortunate that like battery installs are generally like a full 8 to 12 hours. So an electrician can show up on site in the morning, work all day, and get paid for a full day's work. For a residential electrician, that's far more lucrative than doing 3 or 4 house calls. And so we actually have like a very good offering for an electrician. And so we've had we're early days and we need to build out our network more, but we've had a reasonably good time attracting and partnering electricians in an era where in the press you see that there's this massive shortage of trades. We haven't really run into that yet, although obviously we're still small, and so maybe we'll run into it in the future, but right now it's not an issue.
That's super. I definitely see where you're coming from on that. Well, I wanted to, pivot a little bit about talking a little about how you grew on a different side of things, the institutional funding side, right? So you raised from my understanding, you raised from Lure Hippo, if I'm saying that correctly, in October of 2022. Is that correct?
Yeah, we had two leads. We had Lair Hippo and Giant, which is a VC firm out of London. But yeah,
Okay,
the
very
timing's
cool.
right. I think we closed the deal in October.
Okay, very cool. And you raised from them, very well-known venture capital firm. What was raising in the latter half of 2022 like, not only as a company looking to raise sort of like early stage funding, but also a company within energy and climate, which in general, as we've seen, has had some interesting dynamics, I think in the beginning first half of 2023 and definitely at the end of 2022.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we were very fortunate to be just given our backgrounds. Lair Hippo was a seed investor in Casper, and so we've known them for a decade. And then one of the operating partners at Giant, the CEO of this current business, Vinny Campo, he was the US GM of Bulb Energy, which was a retail electric provider in Texas that was actually based in the UK. And his former boss was an operating partner or venture partner at Giant. So it was atypical. We had inside connections, network, track record. They knew us very well. And so I don't generally, when you're doing like a seed round, from what I gathered, having just done it twice, there's a lot of evaluation of the team and some acceptance of like the category. Here, we had passed the evaluation of the team. It was just, did they see that there was a business opportunity here? And even if you pivot a little bit here and there, do they believe that there's something in electrification and residential energy storage? So I think it's atypical just because of our backgrounds, and we're very fortunate in that regard.
It definitely makes sense. I think, I work in venture capital myself. If you see a founder who has demonstrated obvious success in, taking a company pretty far, I think that is obvious cause for confidence and conviction in later investment. I'm wondering this time around, when you went through that process, if, to whatever degree you're comfortable, if you were in conversations with any other, available funders, private funding, things of that nature, and why you eventually decided, to back the people who had backed you originally, but also if there were any considerations in going that route versus, choosing perhaps, if it was on the table, another more, specifically climate only investor, or a new investor on the table, just for the founders who are, potentially fortunate enough to decide between term sheets.
Yeah, it's a good question. We only pitched to those two firms. And then we have another private equity firm, Quantum Innovation Partners, that's innovation fund, that's on our cap table too. And so we did not do a competitive process. I do remember when we had the term sheets, they weren't candidly quite what we were hoping for. This was still, I think, before like the slight hiccup in climate funding. So we thought we should have a slightly higher valuation. But we were faced with like, do we take the term sheet as is and try to negotiate a little bit here and there? Or do we take a step back and run a competitive process and go wider? And you're essentially just trading like dilution for time. And we thought it was both better for the business to just start building the business, because we do think there is, we saw there were some timely things in terms of the energy markets and the Inflation Reduction Act that we wanted to be ready to take advantage of. And then this sounds maybe like it's coming from a very privileged place. We just were more interested in starting to build the business than go out and do a bunch of pitching for seed round funding. And we knew that we would have that time later at an A round if we got there, or a B round if we get there. And so it was kind of a combination of like, a bird in the hand, just go with it, start building the business. Like if you're successful an extra 3 or 4% dilution, you won't even think about it. Well, 5-10 years down the road. And so we just wanted to get going. And so we partnered with people that we trusted, that believed in us. And they've been good partners as we think about the business, think about growing the business. They see a lot of businesses. Lair Hippo is obviously consumer focused. We are a consumer facing business, and so they have good insight there. And then Giant is a more ESG focused fund, so they do have more climate background or more climate focus than Lair Hippo. So we kind of have a balance of both.
Yeah, I think this is quite interesting. I've never, quite candidly, this is like the craziest raising story I've ever heard. I've never heard of this. This is really interesting to chat with you about this. But you mentioned something that obviously we wanted to talk about, which is the IRA. And so I guess would be really curious to have you, I don't know how we should attack this. Probably, can you give us a bit of an explanation to start us off on how specifically the IRA relates to home electrification for people who are unaware? I'm very lightly aware of this. It'd be really helpful for you to give us a bit of a kind of a deep dive here.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit simplifying, but you can think about what the IRA does in two chunks. One is like utility focused, and one is home focused. So when you think about building electrification and homes, there's essentially three parts of it. There had been for a while this rooftop solar tax credit, which is a 30% tax credit. So if you spend $10,000 on rooftop solar, you get to write off $3,000 on your taxes. And so that's a big incentive. They extended that, and which is nice. The other thing they did is they extended it for 10 years. It had always been like re-upped for 1 year, for 2 years. And so it gave stability to the market. They also included battery storage. And so you can do standalone battery storage and get that 30% tax credit, or you can pair battery with solar. And then the other thing they did, which is a little bit nuanced, is you used to have to charge the battery with your rooftop solar, otherwise you couldn't claim the credit. And now you can charge it from solar or charge it from the electric grid, and that enables better economics for a homeowner. Even a homeowner who has solar, there's better economics if you can do some grid charge and grid export. And certainly we've had a small number of customers who don't have solar and just buy batteries. So that's one thing. The second thing on the electrification side, so those are tax credits. There are rebates, essentially like more point of purchase rebates for electrical panel upgrades, electrical wiring upgrades, heat pump installs, and those are a little bit different. Those get passed through the states, and so even though the IRA's, what is it, a year old, 8 months old, whatever, those are just passing through the state. So I'm not even sure there's a state yet where you can claim those rebates, because the states have to set up those programs. But they're significant. I think there's another $10,000 to $15,000 on the table in rebates. And the third thing, which is not home electrification, but is related, as we talked about before, there are rebates for home efficiency upgrades. So insulation, home energy audits, window upgrades. And as I mentioned before, you need to decrease your energy load. That's one of the ways we need it's one of the things we need to do to succeed in greater electrification movement. And then there are related to those, there's some kind of nuanced things in terms of transferability of tax credits, which help businesses like us, but don't necessarily help homeowners. And so that's on the electrification side. That's all kind of for naught if the electricity that those homes are now consuming comes from coal and gas. And so there's a separate set of incentives out there that came through the IRA to incentivize construction of new solar, new wind, different types of energy storage. In addition to batteries, there's many other types of energy storage that are useful on the utility scale. And so we need to transition the utility scale electric grid to renewables in order to make the climate impact we want through home electrification. So that's the two halves of it. that obviously one is homeowner focused, and there's a you know, a lot of incentives out there. The downside is like most, you know, we've done some studying of our consumer base. Most people are unaware of the benefits that are sitting for them in the IRA, and so there needs to be a lot of education done by public institutions and by private businesses, because obviously in our self-interest to educate homeowners about how federal, and we didn't even talk about it, but there are state incentives too, of different flavors that help reduce the cost of ownership and shorten ROI for a lot of these home electrification investments that a homeowner might make.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. That's really helpful. I appreciate that context. So the big thing that I'm really kind of curious about is in terms of your business model and helping homeowners electrify is how does the IRA play into your business model, if you can share this? Because I'm also curious to understand the things you guys are doing differently than other companies trying to help with electrification.
Yeah, for sure. So if you look at the IRA, the very obvious one is the federal tax credit. And so every project, the homeowner gets a 30% reduction in that install cost that they can claim on their taxes. So that's significant. A lot of homes require electrical panel work and service work. Either it's a upgrade of their service level, say from a 100 amp panel to a 200 amp panel, or we have to add a backup sub panel. Like you get into like the nitty gritty of how to design a home electrical system. The rebates program will help. We're not into it yet, but will help cover the cost of some of those upgrades, and they can be significant. A main panel upgrade from 100 to 200 amps could be $4,000 or $5,000, and so that can make a project out of reach. But if there's a $4,000 rebate on it, then it can become affordable for the homeowner. And so those are probably the main things. We don't do much on energy efficiency. I think you could, but we have to stay focused. And I know there are other businesses out there, startups and larger incumbents that are focused on energy efficiency. In some small set of our customers, we go a little bit broader. We've installed EV chargers. We've installed rooftop solar. Those are kind of tangential when somebody's looking to make multiple steps at a time. And in that case, there are other federal incentives in the IRA for, EV adoption, charger installation, rooftop, as I mentioned, PV installation.
Yeah.
So it really is a lubricant for, a market that the federal government is trying to jumpstart.
So basically, just to clarify, I wanted to make sure I got this, because this is the thing that a lot of people talk about is they say, oh, all these companies, it's only going to work because they're basically able to kind of skim through some of the benefits from it. But in reality, the IRA is just simply making it easier for the consumer that you're targeting to say, you know what, actually, we can do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it as like a piece of industrial policy, the federal government has decided that we as a country need to electrify. You have many, both on the labor side and the hardware side, these are like fairly nascent products. Like we maybe have been making dishwashers for 80 years, but we've been making solar cells for 15 to 20 years and residential batteries effectively for about 4 or 5 years, EVs for 10 years. And so I in response to that criticism of like, will these businesses work without the IRA? I think like today, it'd be hard. There'd still be adopters, but they'd be hard. In 5 years or 10 years, when both labor, soft costs, and hardware costs have come down dramatically, then you don't need the IRA anymore. And that's why it sunsets. And so that these businesses become viable on their own without subsidy. And so those lines will cross. And right now, this subsidy is just kickstarting a set of both service and product industries that the government views as important for both like GDP growth and the environment.
Yeah, you said something at the end there that I think is really interesting, like this being the catalyst for a cycle that could, get consumers acquainted with this kind of thing and just sort of start the cycle. The Bessemer Venture Partners, which is one of the most well-known VCs, put out an article about 2 weeks ago, talking about how a lot of solutions within climate, energy, and other innovations related to these areas where we've seen a lot of government funding, how they can succeed, given the fact that there is what some people say government subsidy money propping up business models that aren't commercially viable, right? And I think one thing you expressed is a very interesting and approach to that. Point blank, I'd love to kind of dive into the thing you said at the very end there, which is, do you believe how do you think about a business model outside of the IRA? And in general, maybe advice to people who are in an industry like home electrification that has all these benefits. How do you keep your eye on the North Star of creating a viable business outside of those structures to try and grow and get to venture scale?
Yeah, I mean, if you're building a climate focused business that receives no benefit from the IRA, like if there is a benefit there, you should capitalize on it. It's free money for your customers, so go get it for them or help them get it. That's what the government wanted. If you're building a business in a space where that doesn't exist, yeah, there's obviously more pressure. There's nothing to reduce the cost to your homeowners, and so your value proposition has to, there has to be positive unit economics or like a pathway to positive unit economics. Otherwise, it's not a viable business. And to your earlier comment, it might, yeah, maybe it's good for the planet, but if you're tackling it from a business first approach, the first thing you have to do is build a viable business. Those of us that are benefiting from the IRA, we have to build a business that will remain viable when the IRA sunsets. And in the short term, we'll benefit from it. It gets us going. It lets us build technology. It lets the hardware manufacturers bring down cost. I mean, I think that to me, the amazing thing is we have an example here. Like the Chinese government 10, 15 years ago decided that they wanted to own PV rooftop solar production, and the US government at that time said we didn't want to. And so that all moved to China. They subsidized that industry tremendously, and costs came down. I don't know if it's 10x or 100x. It's enormous. The cost of rooftop solar has come down so dramatically that they don't need subsidies anymore. And so we, in this, very near adjacent industry, we have like the best example you could imagine, like government policy subsidize the industry, and now it doesn't need subsidy anymore. Unfortunately, it was not our government that did it. It was a different government, and now we're trying to get some of that back with the IRA and some of the domestic manufacturing incentives. But it can be done, and it is being done, and we're already seeing the benefits in terms of domestic manufacturing and investment in U.S. infrastructure and capacity to own our part of this kind of change in the electric grid.
Yeah, I think this is that's quite interesting. I really appreciate that that take. I think there's a lot of people, myself included, always debating the merits of policy and actually making things change. But it is a very clear example we're coming off of. Want to move into advice to founders, because obviously this is the kind of the point of the show, and we are running out of time, but I want to get a couple questions in here. So, given your fundraising experience, kind of unconventional fundraising experience, based on your kind of seeing how this went, do you have any particular advice to founders on the fundraising process, things that you would do differently, or just maybe conglomerating advice from your past experiences building ventures as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when we started Casper, it was very different. I don't know, we did 50 or 80 seed round pitches. I guess to the degree that you can afford to do it while you're going through the fundraising process or before, you just have to start building. Obviously, this specific business, Haven, was easier for us. Casper, I do remember Ben Lair, one of the owners or partners at Lair Hippo, we went in, we were investing our own money, visiting factories to design the product. And we, it took a time, but we kept time to fundraise, but we kept building. I remember going to a meeting in their office where we brought like a 2 foot by 2 foot square of the mattress to show them what we were thinking and doing, and nothing. And then he's like, make me a mattress. And I remember we delivered a mattress. We had it hand built at a factory. We delivered it to his house in upstate New York. I swear he conceived his first child on that mattress, although I'm not sure he'll admit it. But it had no cover, no nothing, just like a chunk of foam. And then he slept on it, and then he invested. And so I think you just have to keep building, so you can show progress. You got to find the thing that people need to see so that they can believe in it. The other thing I'd say, both with this new business and with Casper, is if you have partners, like we have supply chains for both of these businesses. We found in both cases a similar business, like a startup mattress manufacturer, and it's not quite a startup, but an earlier stage battery manufacturer. You need to find somebody who's hungry like you to be like your development partner. So if you are in a business where partnerships are important, you got to find, like, I don't know how to say, like, when we started this business 10 months ago, Tesla was not responding my calls when I was asking about Powerwalls. But this other business, Franklin, they would answer our calls. And so we learned a ton from them, and I would hope vice versa. And it helped us make progress and get going. We got to do some installs with free batteries. They let us trial things. And so I think if you're early stage, you don't build in a silo. Get out there, find your partners, find the right partner for you, and just keep, to the degree that you can afford to do it with time and money, just start building, because I believe investors, whether it's a digital product or a physical product, anything tangible just gets them across the line to believe in you and believe in the idea.
And I'm sure a lot of this advice is coming from multiple, like you said, 50 to 80 pitches, multiple operating experiences, a lot of really successful embedded advice here. We do, we know, and we get a lot of feedback from a lot of the founders who listen to this podcast and really appreciate, all of the guidance that you and other, fantastic guests give us. There's so many things that, have gone well that you've been able to execute on. And, for the founders who are hoping to emulate your journey, go in your footsteps, hopefully be, a serial entrepreneur, what are your top 3 pieces of advice as to how they can succeed and do well at what they want to do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you're really, I presume your question is focused on really early stage. And there's nothing novel here. Hiring, your first 10 employees make all the difference in the world. And we don't always get it perfect, but we've had have now and have had in the past, Casper, some phenomenal early employees where we wouldn't have the success we had without them. And so hiring, I would say, is very difficult. So invest the time in it, spend a lot of time with people, leverage your network. It's so important that you got to get it right. Part of that is, like earlier we talked about different audiences. Potential employees are not another audience, so you have to sell them. Like, somebody might be leaving a well-paid job with stock options to come join your 3-person startup with $3 million in the bank if you're lucky. And you need to, they got to dream the dream too and believe in it. I think there's something funny with founder economics. I would be generous with stock options. If it works out, you'll be fine. So don't hoard and don't be too frugal with stock options. You need those important hires to be well incentivized and believe they're owners and be owners. So that's 1. 2, experimentation. So always try things. Like, we've been active in business for 4 months. I think we do something different every week in terms of process or offering whether it's revising proposals or introducing a new financing product, whatever it is, like experiment quickly. It's obviously easier to do if you're building a digital product, if it's live. More like service focused business, a little harder, but I view like seed stage and A round financing as the time you should be experimenting. It's not, you're a VC, so you might disagree with me. I don't think of those as like scaling rounds. It's like, let's just keep experimenting and learning so we can fine tune. And then kind of related to that, which might seem counterintuitive, I would say, is focus. Know what you're trying to do. Don't get too distracted. Yes, experiment, but be very intentional. Have a hypothesis, test it out, see what you learn. I think at Casper, this happened a little bit more later stage in the business. This was one of my learnings. And candidly, like one of the piece of feedback we got from Ben Lair at Lair Hippo is he had gone along for the ride. He was on the board the whole time I was there. And he saw us lose focus. We launched into Europe, lost focus on the US. There was another company that called Purple, which you guys probably heard of, which came up and started to eat our lunch in the US because we were putting a lot of attention in Europe. And then some native companies grew up in Europe and they knew the market and the customers better. We ended up tucking tail. I think we burned $50 million trying to do Europe and walked home, with $50 million less in our pocket. There were a couple things like that at Casper where we did the wrong experiments and didn't have focus. And so I think those are kind of the three things that I would say. And the point Ben reminded us of all this during the fundraising and continues to remind us of this when we talk to him about the business. And so it is kind of nice to have an investor who knows you and it's gone through some ups and downs with you, because he knows essentially what some of our natural tendencies are and can be a check in that regard.
Yeah, I think that's quite interesting. It's not every day that you get that opportunity, especially with the climate ventures. There's not a lot of, I mean, there's obviously people who have raised before and done things, but it's maybe not as common to have that kind of past relationship. But it does make me think a little bit of, if maybe in Ben's shoes, he knows he can invest because he kind of knows the weakness and he can be aware of the things to guide you as a team, right? So I think it's quite interesting. But overall, really appreciate you coming on, Jeff. I think this has been great. I know we had a couple technical difficulties here. We'll sort that out so the listeners have a nice experience. But overall, where can people reach you? What's your call to action for the audience?
Oh man, I'm not on social media. Our business is on all the standard social media channels. Find me on LinkedIn. That's the only one I ever look at. And a call to action, I guess, if your audience is climate founders, I think it's like what's super exciting for us and for me is this is such a generational shift. Like this is the second time we're building an electrical infrastructure and distribution and generation, and so there's so much that can be done. We're bringing layers of intelligence to systems that have been pretty dumb, and so I think there's like so much to be done. It's a huge moment. We're at the like very early stages. So I would say, if you want to start a business here, persevere, experiment, be curious, just try to learn from whomever will talk to you. People like sharing their knowledge. And so just tap into that kind of natural human tendency, and build out your network and don't be afraid to ask for help from people. It is, to your earlier point, like it is somewhat unique in that everybody in the space kind of wants everybody else to succeed, and that certainly was not the case in the mattress industry. And that is like in that regard, you have actually more people out there willing to help you than in probably any other sector out there. So I just tap into it, and learn and move forward.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, we really appreciate you coming on. Looking forward to seeing what you do. And yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. Have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, guys, for the time.